Do you ever envision a time at which women's health issues, as you described them, might end up going back to being a less partisan issue? Obviously, you're a Republican who's staked out a very lonely stance on this issue. Other than you, it has been very partisan. Are you optimistic about that changing?
I actually am very optimistic. I don't feel alone on this issue. I may be the only Republican that votes against certain unconstitutional abortion restrictions.
With Miranda Kahn, J.D. Hayworth welcoming you back to Hour 3 of America's Forum. That interesting exchange, Texas State Representative Sarah Davis with Rachel Maddow on MSNBC saying she stakes out a lonely position. I just got to tell you, during my time in Congress, there were a few members even of the Democrat leadership who were Democrats for life, and by that I mean in a pro-life position, and yet it seems the battle lines have been drawn.
Yeah, for the most part, abortion legislation has been completely partisan, where the Republican Party has taken an overwhelming pro-life stance.
And Democrats seem to be associated with pro-choice, but our next guest actually says the pro-life movement may be in the wrong hands with the GOP. Well, let's get the take of our guest, who is the Associate Professor of Theological and Social Ethics from Fordham University, Charles Camosy. He is the author of the book Beyond the Abortion Wars, A Way Forward for a New Generation. Charles, we appreciate the time. Thanks for joining us from Fordham. The pro-life movement in the wrong hands with the GOP? Explain, please.
Well, I mean, the evidence is just there to anybody who wants to look at it, right? So you may remember just before the anniversary of Roe versus Wade, there was a no-brainer, very popular pain-capable act that the GOP screwed up yet again. And this is not the first time. This happens literally dozens of times every year where the national GOP fails. And it's not surprising, because at the end of the day, you need a big, substantial government to enact federal pro-life legislation, and that's just not where the GOP is. They're the party of small government, not big government.
So where do you think the mistake lies inside the Republican Party? Where are they messing up?
Well, I think actually the Republican Party isn't messing up. So I think the Republican Party is just staying true to their principles. They're just uncomfortable with things that, especially at the federal level, they're much better at the state level when it comes to pro-life laws. But at the federal level, they're just following their philosophy, small government. The mistake, I think, is with the pro-life movement. The pro-life movement has hitched their wagon to the Republican political machine, and they've been disappointed time and time again. It's got to be a bipartisan, broad-based movement if it's going to succeed.
And yet, during my days in Congress, Charles, we enacted with a bipartisan majority a partial birth abortion ban, later struck down by the courts, but no less a Democrat than young Patrick Kennedy voted with us, and we had a bipartisan majority. So really, are the battle lines always drawn along the partisan landscape?
No, that's a good point. It's a somewhat recent development that this has been so polarizing, right? I mean, you look at people like Joe Biden, even Al Gore, Bill Clinton at various times, Jesse Jackson. These were all pretty strongly pro-life individuals in the early part of their political career, and then later they switched. Similarly with Republicans, right? You had Ronald Reagan. He signed California's law making abortion broadly legal in that state. He picked George Herbert Walker Bush as his vice president, who was pro-choice at the time, and George H.W. Bush put pro-choice justices on the Supreme Court. So those are more examples of the failures of the GOP. So yeah, I think at times it seems like people are doing the opposite of what they claim to stand for on this issue, and we have to do something more coherent.
Charles, you talk about in your book a phenomenon you call the Costanza effect. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's a sign that I'm getting older that my students at Fordham don't all know what Seinfeld even is, right? But there's this great episode, for those of you who know the show, where George Costanza does the opposite of his instincts, and everything in the episode turns out great for him in that episode. It's one of the funniest of these.
I remember that one, yeah.
Yeah, and I think the parties essentially engage like George Costanza did in that episode. So the Democrats, we already explained how Republicans claim to stand for big government when it comes to pro-life issues, but the Democrats are no better. So the Democrats claim to stand for justice for the vulnerable and nonviolence and using government to protect the vulnerable, except on abortion, right, where Democrats sound exactly like Republicans, individual freedom, choice, small government, stay out of my life, et cetera, et cetera. So, and then it works out very well for them. They get to raise money. They get to, every election cycle, they get to claim to their pro-life and pro-choice bases, give us money, give us support, and then they don't deliver because, quite frankly, that's not where their political heart is.
Well, Charles Camosy, we're going to ask you to stay with us. After the break, we'll talk more about your book and a way forward if we can find some sort of agreement on what is a polarizing issue. There's more ahead with our guest when we continue on America's Forum.
We are not going to be able to finish the trafficking bill until this gets resolved, and this will have an impact on the timing of considering the new Attorney General. Now, I had hoped to turn to her next week, but if we can't finish the trafficking bill, she will be put off again. They need to come to grips with this.
Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell on CNN explaining that the Democrat minority in the Senate has a choice. Finish work on the human trafficking bill, or the Senate will just have to wait to confirm Loretta Lynch as Attorney General. Back now on America's Forum with Miranda Kahn. Now, Miranda, to be fair to the Democrats, they're concerned because of a provision in a bill that would bar money from those federal funds being used for abortions.
Yeah, but Republicans are firing back, saying the language in the bill has never changed and that Dems failed to actually read the bill.
So you got to read the bill. May have been in there a small provision.
Note to self.
We're going to continue our conversation with Charles Camosy, who is the author of Beyond the Abortion Wars, A Way Forward for a New Generation. Charles, we appreciate it. One of the universal laments is that legislatively, to get work done, there are votes like this where people have to go on the record and where disagreements occur. Mindful of that, do you have a suggestion on how to move forward?
Well, I mean, you could. This is Exhibit A for our need to move beyond the abortion wars, right? We can't even pass a wildly popular human sex trafficking bill because abortion wars, right? It's just, it infects almost everything that it touches. Listen, here's what's happened. So the Democrats got a call from very strong pro-choice lobbyists and said, you have to kill this bill because it's essentially got the Hyde Amendment language, which says the federal government can't pay for abortions. And so they did that. And then the Republicans base, pro-life base, says, no, you can't get rid of this language. You have to keep it in, even though the Hyde Amendment has exceptions for when pregnancy takes place as a result of sexual violence. And of course, that's exactly what human trafficking is. It's sexual violence. That's why everyone thinks it's so horrible and why we need this legislation. So we have these extremists fighting with each other when the American people are so far away from this kind of political infighting, war. Let's call it what it is, war. And I think, again, as I said in the last segment, the pro-life movement needs to move beyond this sort of squabbling and take a broad-based approach, because actually most Americans agree with a generally pro-life point of view.
As I'm looking at you right now, we're also seeing video of mainly women. I can't help but wonder, why has this conversation mainly been driven by men?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, in part because women have a very different point of view than the battle men have been fighting for the last 40, 50 years. It's interesting, a lot of people think of the pro-choice point of view as being sort of pro-woman, but if you look at the history, it says something very different about that, doesn't it? The 7 justices on the Supreme Court which gave us Roe were all men. The lower court cases were funded by the Playboy Foundation and Hugh Hefner, the lower court cases which got us to Roe. Some of the most interesting voices in the debate are pro-life women and reproductive justice women, and they take us in a very different direction from this sort of like ridiculous squabbling we see going on.
Well, Charles, apart from gender, you talk about a change demographically, that millennials who seem ready to embrace same-sex marriage, when it comes to the question of abortion, they are overwhelmingly pro-life. Got about a minute and a half. You want to explain that?
Yeah, so I think that's a very important signal of a change that's actually already here with millennials. It's not coming; it's already here. I see them in my classroom every semester, and the statistics and demographics are unmistakable. We used to think of abortion and gay marriage as almost the same word. In fact, some of my colleagues on Twitter like to think of abortion and same-sex marriage without putting any spaces between the words because they're the same issue. Not so at all with millennials. Millennials have largely embraced same-sex marriage, or at least the legality of it, and they're increasingely skeptical of abortion. They are now tied with seniors as the group most likely to oppose abortion. So there, I think, is a very, very hopeful shift from our sort of old right versus left 1970s type politics. 50% of millennials identify with neither party. And they have good reason, given what we've been given over the last few decades, I think.
Charles, with the few seconds we have remaining, just want to ask you real quickly, will this debate ever end? Will we ever have a compromise reached between millennials, Democrats, Republicans, whomever?
Got about 30 seconds, Charles.
Yes, we will. I feel very confident about that. I mean, I don't think we'll ever be totally comfortable with it. It's one of those issues that, of its very nature, whichever way you go, it provides something uncomfortable for us to think about. But yes, we've already made broad progress in terms of what people actually think about this issue. The key is to get beyond the old, tired 1970s ways, 1980s ways.
One way to do that is with the new book that Charles Camosy has authored. Again, the title, Beyond the Abortion Wars, A Way Forward for a New Generation. Charles Camosy, we thank you. We're moving forward with America's Forum. Stay tuned.